It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Hollowbrook, and the streets were bustling with holiday cheer. Children ran around, clutching their Christmas wish lists, while families gathered at the town square for the annual holiday festivities. The highlight of the event was always the appearance of Santa Claus at the local mall. He would sit in his throne, handing out candy canes and posing for pictures with the kids. But there was something off about this year's Santa. His suit was perfectly tailored, his beard thick and snow-white, and his laugh was deep and booming, just as you'd expect. Yet when he looked into the eyes of the children, there was a coldness behind his smile, a darkness that sent a shiver down their spines. Little Emma, only 8 years old, had been eagerly waiting in line for hours with her mother, excited to tell Santa her Christmas wish. She finally made it to the front, her heart racing with anticipation. As she climbed onto his lap, she felt a sudden chill in the air, as though the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees. "Ho, ho, ho! And what would you like for Christmas, little girl?" Santa's voice rumbled, but it sounded almost too deep, too hollow. Emma hesitated for a moment, unsure why she felt uneasy, but then blurted out, "I want a puppy." A real, fluffy puppy, just like the one in the pet store window. Santa's grin stretched unnaturally wide, and his eyes locked onto hers. For a brief moment, Emma felt as though he was peering into her soul. "A puppy, you say?" Santa repeated, his voice now lower, almost a whisper. "What a lovely wish." His cold breath brushed against her cheek, and she shivered. Before she could say anything else, her mother gently tugged her away, as the next child in line took their place. Emma shot one last glance at Santa, but his eyes followed her, unblinking, as if they were watching her every move. That night, after the mall had closed, something strange happened. Santa, or rather the man dressed as Santa, was seen outside the mall, pacing the empty parking lot. He was muttering to himself, his voice barely audible above the wind. They never listen, never learn. This year will be different. Emma, unable to sleep, lay wide awake in her bed. She couldn't shake the image of Santa's unsettling gaze. She pulled the covers tightly around her, trying to push the thought from her mind, but the more she tried, the more the unease grew. The clock struck midnight. Suddenly there was a soft tap on the window. At first, Emma thought it was just the wind, but the tapping continued, persistent and deliberate. Her heart raced. She slowly got out of bed, tiptoeing toward the window. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to see nothing. Then a shadow moved across the snow-covered ground below. A figure dressed in the unmistakable red suit of Santa Claus stood in her front yard, staring up at her window. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but Emma could see his white-gloved hand raised toward her, beckoning. Frozen in fear, Emma backed away from the window, her mind racing. What was Santa doing outside her house at this hour? What did he want? The tapping came again, but this time it was louder, more urgent. A soft, eerie voice called out to her. "Emma, Emma, come to the window." She stumbled back, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to look again, but she couldn't stop herself. She glanced back at the window, and there he was, standing even closer now, his face twisted in an unnatural grin. His eyes were no longer friendly or warm. They were dark and hollow, voids that seemed to suck in the light. "Come, Emma," he whispered. "Your wish is about to come true." The breath caught in her throat, and just as she turned to run to her parents' room, the lights flickered and the door to her bedroom creaked open on its own. Emma froze, staring at the dark figure in the doorway. The silhouette of Santa loomed in the doorway, his voice a low growl. "I've come to deliver your gift, Emma." She screamed, but no sound came out. The next morning, Emma's parents found her in her bed, wide-eyed and trembling, clinging to the covers as if they were the only thing holding her to reality. The window was wide open, the curtains blowing in the cold breeze, but there was no sign of anyone outside. Confused and alarmed, they asked her what had happened, but Emma couldn't explain. All she could remember was the feeling of being watched, the voice calling her name, and that dark figure standing in her window. Later that afternoon, Emma's mother went to check on the presents under the tree. But there was something new, a small, strange box wrapped in red paper. It had no name tag, no label, just a simple, cryptic bow on top. When she opened it, a small black puppy sat inside, its eyes wide and unblinking. But there was something wrong with the puppy. It had a collar around its neck, a collar that read "Naughty List." Emma stared at the puppy, and then her mother noticed something else. At the bottom of the box, written in a familiar script, was a note that simply said, "For Emma, from Santa." That night, Emma could hear the tapping again, but this time it wasn't at the window. It was coming from the walls, from everywhere. And when she closed her eyes, she saw that dark, hollow-eyed Santa standing outside her window, always watching, waiting. The Thompson family had just moved into their new home on the outskirts of a quiet town. They were eager to celebrate their first Christmas in the big, old house. The home was charming, albeit a little worn, with creaky floorboards and tall, drafty windows. Still, it was perfect for a fresh start. Emma, the youngest of the two children, couldn't wait to decorate the massive tree in the living room. She had always dreamed of a Christmas tree so big that the decorations seemed to sparkle and shine forever. One crisp winter afternoon, the family went to a local antique shop, hoping to find some unique ornaments to add to their collection. It was there, tucked away in the corner of the shop, that they saw it. A beautiful, vintage Christmas tree, unlike anything they had ever seen. The tree was covered in intricate silver tinsel, delicate glass baubles, and twinkling fairy lights. The shopkeeper claimed the tree had been in his family for generations, but there was something about it that sent a chill down Emma's spine. "We'll take it," her parents decided, charmed by the tree's elegant beauty. That night, after setting up the tree, something strange began to happen. Every time Emma and her brother Dylan turned their backs, the ornaments seemed to change. At first, it was subtle. A few decorations would be out of place, or the tinsel would hang differently. But the next morning, the tree was completely different. Some of the ornaments had been replaced with ones that looked older, cracked and worn, like relics from another time. Emma grew uneasy, but her parents dismissed it. "It's probably just the kids playing around," her mother said, shaking her head. "Or maybe we're just imagining things." However, things escalated quickly. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Emma heard soft whispers coming from the living room. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then the whispers grew louder, forming words she could barely understand. Curiosity got the best of her, and she quietly crept downstairs. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, the living room light flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the walls. There, standing under the tree, was a dark figure. It was tall and cloaked in a flowing, shadowy robe. It didn't seem to have a face, only darkness. Emma's heart raced as the figure slowly turned toward her, its presence so cold that the air around her seemed to freeze. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, though she could barely make a sound. The figure remained silent, but Emma's eyes were drawn to the tree. The ornaments on the branches were now completely different, old, tarnished, and broken. Her heart raced as the temperature dropped further and an icy gust of wind whipped through the house, slamming the door shut behind her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they turned into a voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Sarah, I was once like you. I thought the house was a gift too, but now it's my prison. Sarah's blood ran cold as the voice continued, each word cutting through the silence like a knife. In the days that followed, the family began to notice that strange things kept happening around the house. Objects would move on their own, doors would creak open, and cold drafts would sweep through rooms where there was no draft. Emma's nightmares grew worse, filled with images of the cloaked figure standing beside the tree, its eyes empty and hollow. One evening, Emma's father, determined to find the source of the strange occurrences, decided to investigate the tree. He carefully removed each ornament, inspecting them one by one. But as he touched the final ornament, the tree seemed to react violently. The branches shook and the lights flickered on and off. He heard a low, guttural whisper. "You should not have touched it." Suddenly, the tree began to move on its own, the branches twisting in unnatural ways. Emma's father screamed, stumbling backward, but the tree's branches seemed to reach for him, wrapping around his arm. He struggled to free himself, but the tree's grip tightened, pulling him toward the dark figure that now stood behind it. Emma and Dylan rushed to their father's side, trying to pull him away, but the figure, now fully visible, loomed over them, its face still hidden in darkness. "You have awakened what was buried," it whispered, in a voice like the rustling of dead leaves. This tree was never meant to be disturbed. With a final, terrified cry, Emma's father was yanked into the tree, his body vanishing into the twisted branches. The room fell silent once again. The next morning, the tree was perfectly normal. No twisted branches, no dark figure. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But Emma and Dylan knew the truth. They could feel it deep in their bones. The tree wasn't just an ornament. It was something far more sinister, a gateway to something dark and ancient. For the rest of the holiday season, the Thompsons' house was never the same. The tree stood proudly in the corner, its lights twinkling merrily, but Emma knew better. It was waiting for the next soul to fall into its grasp. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Dunridge, a place where time seemed to slow down the closer you got to the rolling hills on the outskirts of town. The houses were covered in snow, their windows glowing warmly with the soft light of Christmas trees inside. For most, it was a time for celebration and family. But for one particular house, it was a night to be feared. The old Ashford house had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, ever since the family mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Now it stood like a dark, forgotten monument to an unknown horror. Its windows boarded up, the wind howling through the cracks in its broken walls. Lena, a curious teenager who had heard the stories of the house since she was little, stood at the edge of the property late that night. She had grown tired of hearing people whisper about the ghost of Christmas Eve that haunted the house, about the strange lights that appeared in the windows when no one was there. Tonight, she was determined to find out the truth for herself. Armed with only a flashlight and her resolve, she pushed open the rusted gate and stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the mansion's front door. As she walked closer, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and causing the branches to groan, as if the house itself was alive and warning her to stay away. But Lena wasn't afraid. She had grown up hearing the same warnings, and nothing could keep her from uncovering the truth. When she reached the front door, she paused. The wind had died down, and an unnatural stillness filled the air. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open, the sound of creaking hinges echoing through the empty night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. The grand chandelier above had long since lost its luster, the crystals hanging crookedly as if caught in some invisible force. The walls were lined with old paintings that had grown grimy with age, their once beautiful scenes now distorted and dark. Lena shone her flashlight around, the beam cutting through the shadows, revealing nothing but old furniture, broken glass, and dust-covered floorboards. She began to explore, moving deeper into the house. The farther she went, the colder the air grew, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house seemed to breathe, the floorboards creaking underfoot like whispers in the dark. When she reached the grand staircase, she hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity pushed her onward. The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed, and each step seemed to echo louder than the last. At the top, a long hallway stretched out before her, its walls lined with doors, each one seemingly locked or blocked by piles of debris. But one door stood ajar, the faintest glow emanating from within. Lena approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached for the doorknob, the temperature dropped dramatically, her breath visible in the air. She could feel her pulse quicken as a strange energy filled the room. Slowly, she opened the door. Inside, a single candle flickered on a small table, casting long shadows against the walls. The room was simple, with nothing but an old rocking chair, a fireplace long abandoned, and a mirror that seemed out of place. It was large, framed in gold, and covered in a thin layer of dust. As Lena stepped inside, she noticed the mirror. Its surface was oddly clear, far cleaner than everything else in the room. She moved closer, staring into her reflection, but as she did, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. In the reflection, someone else stood behind her. It was a tall figure, shrouded in dark robes, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. Lena froze, unable to look away as the figure slowly raised a hand, its long, skeletal fingers pointing directly at her. A voice rasped from behind her, "You shouldn't have come," sending a shock of cold terror through her body. She turned around in a panic, but the room was empty. Nothing but the flickering candle and the quiet creaking of the house. Yet, in the mirror, the figure remained, its glowing eyes fixed on her, a twisted grin curling across its face. Lena stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps as she turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, trapping her inside. The temperature plummeted, and she could see her breath in the cold, thick air. Panic surged through her as the lights flickered, casting the room in a flickering strobe of light and shadow. The figure in the mirror began to move, its fingers twitching as if preparing to reach out. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor above. Lena's heart raced as she backed toward the door, her mind racing. There was no way out. She reached for the door handle, but it was stuck, as if something was holding it shut. The whispers began again, this time louder and more urgent, coming from the walls, the floors, the very air itself. They whispered, "Get out, now!" But Lena couldn't move. It felt like the house itself was alive, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The mirror began to crack, the thin spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface, and Lena's reflection distorted, becoming more monstrous by the second. Her own face seemed to twist into a grotesque mask of terror, the figure behind her laughing, its voice hollow and deep. The last thing Lena saw before the darkness overtook her was the figure stepping forward from the mirror, its hands reaching for her, and its voice whispering in her ear. "Merry Christmas, Lena." It was a quiet Christmas Eve when the Taylor family moved into their new home. The house, a grand Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, was a gift from a distant relative, a mysterious aunt they had never met. The previous owners had left abruptly, and the house had been vacant for years. As they unpacked their boxes, the faintest chills seemed to settle over the house, but they brushed it off as nothing more than the winter air. Later that night, as the family gathered around the Christmas tree, the clock struck midnight. That's when it began. Soft whispers, barely audible at first, but they grew louder with every passing minute. Sarah, the mother, was the first to notice it. Something odd about the air. It was thick, almost suffocating. The house felt alive, as though it had its own pulse, its own heartbeat. The whispers grew into soft murmurs, circling the room, as if there was someone right behind them. She turned, expecting to see her husband, but there was no one there. Her breath caught in her throat as the temperature in the room dropped. The fire in the hearth flickered violently before going out, plunging them into complete darkness. She whispered, "Who's there?" her voice trembling. But no one answered. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking through the hallways. Sarah's heart pounded. She grabbed her daughter, Mia, and pulled her close, her eyes scanning the darkened corners of the room. A sudden knock at the door broke the silence. Hesitant, Sarah approached it, hand trembling as she reached for the handle. When she opened the door, no one was there, but on the doorstep was a single old-fashioned letter, sealed with a wax insignia. She picked it up, the hairs on her neck standing on end, as she noticed the letter was addressed to her by name, even though she had never lived in the house before. With shaky hands, Sarah opened the letter, revealing a chilling message. "Beware the secrets this house holds. You are not alone. Midnight is when it wakes." Her heart raced as the temperature dropped further and an icy gust of wind whipped through the house, slamming the door shut behind her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they turned into a voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Sarah, I was once like you. I thought the house was a gift too, but now it's my prison." Sarah's blood ran cold as the voice continued, each word cutting through the silence like a knife. The whispers revealed a terrifying truth. The previous owners hadn't left. They had vanished without a trace, swallowed up by the house's curse. The house was alive, feeding on the souls of its inhabitants. In a panic, Sarah grabbed her family and ran out of the house. But as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. The voice echoed in her mind, haunting her every step. The house wasn't done with them. The spirit of Christmas Eve had a dark, twisted secret, one that wouldn't let them go. As the family stood outside, the mansion loomed behind them, its windows glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The Christmas bells rang from a nearby church, but instead of a joyful sound, they were twisted, distorted, a warning. The ghost of Christmas Eve had claimed yet another victim, and the Taylors knew they had narrowly escaped its grasp.